If this video reached you right now, at the very moment you're reading this sentence, you may have sensed that this isn't an ordinary coincidence. From a quantum perspective, time isn't a rigid line flowing forward like calendar pages. It's a field that bends, intensifies, and thins out at specific moments along with consciousness. Consciousness doesn't receive the information it needs early or late. It only draws it into experience when it's ready. That's why some messages don't appear for months, while others suddenly appear, as if they want to find you. This video is one of those messages, because, whether you're aware of it or not, you're approaching a certain threshold in the observer cycle, and these thresholds usually manifest themselves not in the external world, but in moments of inner silence. Perhaps you've recently noticed recurring themes in your life, the same emotions, similar relationships, decisions that seem different but end up in the same place. While your mind says, "I'm moving forward," an inner part of you may still feel like it's stuck in the same spot. From a quantum field perspective, this isn't a mistake. This is a natural reflection of the fact that the frequency signature hasn't changed yet, because the field takes seriously not your intentions, but your subconsciously automated reactions. Every emotional response you give without realizing it produces an observer signal that recalls the same possibilities. And this signal folds time around itself, bringing you back to a familiar experience. It is precisely at this point that this video reaching you becomes meaningful, because consciousness doesn't continue the same cycle forever. It creates a stop-and-look moment for itself at certain intervals. These moments sometimes manifest as a sentence, sometimes as an encounter, and sometimes as a feeling of unease you can't explain. That vague unease that arises within you is not actually an indication that you are on the wrong path. It is an indication that you are preparing for a broader level of perception. In quantum consciousness, this is defined as the observer's position beginning to shift. That is, you are no longer just within the experience, but approaching the point of observing the experience. Dates like December 20th are not magical in themselves. However, they function as time periods where certain frequency densities intersect in the collective consciousness. During such periods, time feels more permeable, symbols repeat more frequently, and some messages are heard more clearly than usual. If you too have been feeling lately that something needs to change, but what? This question actually indicates that the answer is approaching. Because the quantum field doesn't overwhelm you with answers. It first matures the question. This video is not here to impose a solution on you, but to make you aware of the source of that question. It's important to understand this. This narrative is neither a warning nor a call to action. It's a reminder. You are not entirely unfamiliar with this information. Perhaps you felt it before. Perhaps you noticed it for a moment. But you covered it up amidst the noise of daily life. Now, the same information is resurfacing in a different form, because consciousness doesn't erase rejected awareness. It only waits until it's time. And as you read these lines, you have already stepped into that time. Therefore, it is enough to ask yourself this question. What does this video evoke in me? A belief, a doubt, or an inexplicable calmness? At the quantum level, the most powerful signals are not definitive answers, but inner pauses, because true change begins not with noise, but with perceived silence. And if you can feel this silence right now, this video has already achieved its purpose. The important thing here is not to draw this message into a mental debate of right or wrong. Quantum consciousness is not persuaded, it is perceived. The mind's exhaustion in searching for answers is one of the first signs that consciousness is beginning to awaken. Because when habitual thought patterns begin to unravel, old explanations are no longer sufficient. It is at these moments that a person becomes more constrained as they try to maintain control. However, the quantum field does not demand control. It demands harmony, and harmony does not arise from force, but from the gentle withdrawal of the observer's position. As you read these lines, perhaps for the first time you are approaching not understanding something, but feeling it. This transition is a small but irreversible movement of consciousness. And it is also important to know that these moments of awareness usually occur not immediately before major life changes, but during periods of pause that seem to indicate nothing is happening. You usually perceive time as a line flowing forward. Yesterday is behind us, and tomorrow has yet to arrive. However, from a quantum perspective, time is not a mechanism independent of consciousness. Time intensifies, slows down, or thins out depending on the observer's position. This is why some moments of the same day feel heavy and exhausting, while others pass unnoticed, because consciousness does not experience every moment with equal depth. This is precisely where what we call the observer cycle comes into play. How you perceive a situation, time begins to take shape around that perception. Every experience viewed with the same emotion produces a similar time texture, and this texture carries you back to a familiar reality. This cycle is often unnoticed because the mind usually confuses change with changes in events. However, at the quantum level, what happens occurs in the perception itself before the events. As long as you give the same internal response, time feels as if it is not moving forward. There are new people, new circumstances, new decisions, but the internal outcome is the same. This is not like a record stuck at the same point. Rather, it's more like the record being presented to you with a slightly different cover each time. From the outside, it seems like there's change, but inside, the same melody continues to play. The observer's cycle is precisely the name given to this silent repetition. The concept of time thinning becomes important here. At certain times, days feel short but intense. Symbols increase, encounters become meaningful, thoughts accelerate. This isn't an acceleration of time. It's a transparency of time. Consciousness begins to perceive details it wouldn't normally notice. This thinning usually occurs when the cycle is close to breaking, because when consciousness struggles to reproduce the same experience repeatedly, the fabric of reality begins to stretch. At this stage, people often feel unease. An inexplicable tension or disorientation arises. However, this feeling doesn't indicate loss, but rather that the old coordinates have lost their validity. The strongest aspect of the observer's cycle is its self-justification. The mind produces logical explanations for each repetition. The circumstances were like that. It couldn't have been otherwise. People are always the same. These explanations provide the energy necessary for the continuation of the cycle, because as long as the observer believes that the point where they need to change lies in the external world, they maintain their own position. In the quantum realm, every observer who remains stationary is considered to have reselected the same possibilities. Time here acts like a teacher. It doesn't punish you, but repeats the same lesson until you understand it. That's why moments when time thins out are valuable, because in these moments, consciousness weakens its accustomed defenses. For the first time, a person approaches the thought. Perhaps the problem isn't in the conditions. This approach isn't an answer. It's a gap. And the most powerful transformations at the quantum level begin precisely in these gaps. A new identity hasn't yet formed, but the old one has begun to dissolve. At this point, time neither moves forward nor backward. It deepens. When you realize this depth, you begin to transform from merely being within the experience to an observer looking at the fabric of the experience. The dissolution of the observer cycle becomes possible precisely here. The mistake most people make at this stage is trying to accelerate the thinning of time, thinking more, analyzing more, making clearer decisions. However, in the quantum perspective, the effort to accelerate is another facet of the cycle. Time doesn't intensify under pressure. It dissolves when accepted. When the observer pushes the mind forward to make sense of everything, consciousness retreats. This causes time to thicken again, returning to its previous level of perceptual density. Therefore, some moments of awareness are brief, followed by a return to the old sensation. This is not a regression. It is a natural process testing, where the observer still stands. In moments when time truly thins, the need for control subtly diminishes. One realizes they are progressing more through signs than answers. Small details, moments previously considered insignificant. Unexpected inner clarity emerges. This is not the quantum field imposing a new reality on you. It is the result of your inability to maintain the old reality in the same way. The observer cycle begins to crack here, because when consciousness stops identifying itself with repeating patterns, time also stops carrying those patterns. That is why the thinning of time is not an opportunity to be missed. It is a transformation that begins to operate once it is noticed. People often think they clearly articulate what they want in life. They believe they've determined their direction with words, plans, and intentions. However, at the quantum level, what determines reality isn't the sentences you speak, but the habitual emotions vibrating within you as you utter them. This is called a frequency signature. This signature consists of internal reactions that repeat themselves without your awareness. And the quantum field recognizes you based on this signature. If you get angry in similar ways at the same events, feel the same fear and the same uncertainties, and associate the same hopes with the same disappointments, the field assumes you're not changing, but simply trying again. Because unless the frequency changes, the pool of possibilities doesn't change either. This is where the concept of silent change comes into play. True transformation is almost imperceptible from the outside. It doesn't begin with big decisions, dramatic breaks, or sudden changes of direction. On the contrary, it often emerges with an internal stillness that feels like nothing is happening. People mistake this for stagnation. However, consciousness reduces the noise before changing the frequency signature. Because when the old reactions subside, space opens up for a new vibration to occur. The quantum field works with emptiness, not through fullness. Therefore, silence is not a lack of change, but its foundation. The frequency signature reveals itself most clearly at unexpected moments. When you realize you don't react as strongly to a situation as before, when you feel a thought doesn't sweep you off your feet as it used to, or when you see that the usual emotion doesn't come in response to a result. These moments show that even if nothing seems to have changed in the outside world, much has shifted internally. People often underestimate these moments. They dismiss them by saying, "That's just how I am." However, at the quantum level, these small deviations are the clearest signs that the cycle is beginning to break. Because frequency transforms not with large leaps, but with steady, small shifts. The compelling aspect of silent change is that it doesn't require proof. The mind wants to see the change. It wants results. It seeks confirmation. But what is happening at the frequency level hasn't yet materialized. That's why a person might feel nothing is happening. Yet, precisely at this point, the old reality can no longer recall you in the same way. The quantum field is still trying to clarify what to do with your new signature. If this gap is filled with impatience, the old pattern will return. But if it is carried with awareness, new possibilities will spontaneously emerge. This is the most critical test of silent change. At this stage, the important thing to remember is not to force yourself to feel positive. Frequency signature changes not with suppressed emotions, but with conscious reactions. Ignoring a feeling that passes through you doesn't transform it. It only pushes it underground. Quantum consciousness works with sincerity. It wants you to first see what you feel. Silent change is not the disappearance of emotions. It's the cessation of their control over you. The reaction is still there, but it's not automatic. This automaticity is where the observer cycle weakens. If this description sounds familiar to you, your frequency signature has most likely already begun to decipher, because this kind of information seems interesting to a consciousness still tightly bound within the same cycle, but it doesn't touch it. Information that touches reaches those who are ready. If you are experiencing an inner stillness while reading these lines, that is silent change itself. And at the quantum level, the most lasting transformations begin precisely like this. Without anyone noticing, sometimes even without you being sure. But once it begins, the old reality can't hold you as it was. The most challenging aspect of this process is that the outside world seems to still operate according to the same rules. People use the same phrases, daily life flows at the same pace, and problems present themselves with familiar faces. This gives rise to the question, is anything really changing? However, when the frequency signature changes, reality doesn't immediately transform. First, it stops reacting. Old triggers lose their effect. Dramatic ups and downs weaken. This is perceived as a disappointment for most people, because the mind is accustomed to associating change with visible evidence. But in the quantum realm, visibility is the final stage. The actual transformation is completed silently until that stage is reached. Perhaps the most important indicator of silent change is the gradual dissolving of the sense of urgency. The quantum field never speaks loudly. Its language is not warnings, threats, or definitive instructions. The quantum field doesn't force you. It calls you. However, this call isn't as clear and loud as most people expect. Rather, it manifests itself through recurring symbols, unexpected pauses, and inner feelings you can't explain. People usually expect grand signs. They hope for a sudden change in life, to see a clear signpost. But the quantum field tests whether consciousness is ready. If consciousness is still clinging tightly to old patterns, the call remains gentle. Because forced awareness produces defense, not transformation. The first form of this silent invitation usually appears through recurring encounters. The same theme appearing with different facets, hearing similar sentences from different mouths, the same questions swirling in your mind. None of this is coincidental. From a quantum perspective, these repetitions indicate that consciousness hasn't yet fully internalized a particular message. The field repeats, not to punish you, but to make you aware. At this point, people often feel bored, stuck, or unable to progress. What actually happens is that consciousness attempts to resolve the old perception before transitioning to a new reality. The silent invitation is this process of resolution itself. The invitation from the quantum field often comes with a feeling of emptiness. Things that used to motivate you no longer have the same effect. Some goals become meaningless. Some desires slowly recede. This is often mistakenly interpreted as loss by many people. However, it is not a loss. It is a readjustment of frequency. Consciousness struggles to hold on to experiences that are no longer in harmony with it. The field doesn't force you into something new. It simply makes it unable to carry the old. Therefore, the quantum invitation usually begins with a process of letting go. What is let go of are not things that are not yours. They are things that no longer vibrate the same as yours. Another characteristic of this invitation is that it alters temporal perception. Days sometimes fly by quickly, sometimes they feel heavy. Some memories from the past unexpectedly come to mind, while the future doesn't present a clear picture. This is not a distortion of time. It is a change in consciousness's perspective on time. In the quantum field, the past and the future regain meaning according to the consciousness's current state. The silent invitation draws you precisely to this now point. Because transformation is not about repairing the past or controlling the future. It's about recognizing your current position as an observer. Many people begin to rush at this stage. They want to fill the void, end the uncertainty, find a new identity or direction. But the quantum field works with harmony, not haste. The silent invitation asks you to remain suspended for a while. This state of suspension is uncomfortable for many people because it weakens the sense of control. Yet, the weakening of control is necessary for the strengthening of awareness. Consciousness expands not when it thinks it controls everything, but when it accepts that it is observing. The invitation of the quantum field invites you precisely to this position of observer. Therefore, instead of thinking of this invitation as a call, it is more accurate to see it as a reminder. It is not here to teach you something new. It is here to bring to the surface an awareness you already knew but postponed. If this explanation creates a slight inner calm in you, the invitation has reached its destination. Because the quantum field is heard not loudly, but when you are silent, and when you notice this silence, the invitation has already been accepted. The most challenging aspect of this silent invitation is that it doesn't promise clarity. When the human mind senses it's in the midst of a process, it immediately wants to label it. This is a crisis. This is a transformation. This is a waiting period. The quantum field works with experience, not labels. Every process labeled is drawn into the mind's control, weakening the invitation's effect. That's why some people, when they reach the threshold, unconsciously revert to old definitions, because remaining with the unknown can be even more uncomfortable than the known pain. The silent invitation is precisely aimed at dismantling this comfort zone. It doesn't show you direction. It makes you question the need for direction itself. Even a small detail noticed at this stage can trigger a major inner shift, not clinging to a sentence as much as before, an expectation spontaneously loosening, an outcome no longer seeming vital. While these may seem insignificant on the surface, from a quantum perspective, they indicate that the map of consciousness is being redrawn. People often think they are aware of what they are experiencing. They believe they know what they feel, what they think, and why they react. At the quantum level of consciousness, the real breakthrough begins not with noticing what is happening, but with noticing the point of awareness of what is observing it. This is precisely what we call meta-observation. While you think you are only observing your thoughts, there is actually a deeper layer of consciousness observing those thoughts. Most people spend a lifetime without ever experiencing this layer, because when the mind becomes aware of the consciousness observing it, it feels its control is shrinking. Therefore, it constantly draws its attention to external events, emotions, and narratives. Meta-observation silently continues to exist despite this escape of the mind. Observing the one observing you often doesn't feel like doing something. On the contrary, it's like learning not to do. Thoughts are allowed to flow. Emotions are not suppressed but not directed. At this point, a person realizes for the first time that there is a distance between themselves and a thought. That thought is still there, but it is no longer at the center. In a quantum perspective, this is the observer moving from being immersed in the experience to beginning to look at the fabric of the experience. When this perspective changes, the same events produce different effects, because what determines reality is not the event itself, but the point of consciousness from which it is viewed. Meta-observation often brings an unsettling clarity. People realize that many reactions they've previously attributed to "this is who I am" are actually automatic patterns. This realization creates both freedom and a brief void, because while the old identity dissolves, the new one hasn't yet formed. In this void, one may feel vulnerable. However, in quantum consciousness, this vulnerability doesn't mean weakness, but permeability. Through this permeability, consciousness can come into contact with new possibilities. Meta-observation doesn't leave you powerless. It makes you flexible. In this process, the perception of time also begins to change. Reactions slow down, decisions are postponed, the feeling of urgency dissolves. This isn't indecision. It's the consciousness no longer producing automatic responses. In meta-observation, one watches an emotion arise, notices its growth, and witnesses its resolution. This witnessing doesn't suppress the emotion, but it doesn't direct it either. This lack of direction is a real power in the quantum field, because direction comes from old patterns. Directionlessness, however, opens up space for the emergence of the new. The mind perceives this as a threat, but consciousness experiences it as an expansion. Observing the observer doesn't turn you into a passive spectator. On the contrary, it makes you a more conscious participant, because now you can see the source of your reactions. When something triggers you, you notice not only the triggered state but also how the trigger occurred. This awareness makes it difficult for the same cycle to repeat. In a quantum perspective, cycles work as long as they are not noticed. Meta-observation eliminates this invisibility. The cycle still exists, but it is no longer automatic. And nothing that is not automatic can retain its former power. The biggest misconception a person faces at this stage is trying to make this state permanent. Meta-observation is not a position to be held continuously. It emerges intermittently, then withdraws. The mind interprets this withdrawal as, "I have lost." However, once consciousness experiences meta-observation, it does not completely return to its former state. A door has been opened, and it will never completely close. Even if you don't notice it, the observing consciousness continues to exist in the background. And this presence is the quietest yet most powerful foundation of true transformation. Because once you learn to observe the observer, no experience can draw you in as much as before. The most subtle yet transformative aspect of meta-observation is that judgment begins to dissolve. People constantly evaluate not only others but also themselves. Did they do the right thing? Did they feel adequate? Should they have done more? This internal flow of judgment operates at the center of consciousness. As long as it remains unnoticed, experiences no longer appear merely as fragments of a personal story. They become temporary scenes of a larger movement of consciousness. This perception does not create detachment. On the contrary, it creates a deep sense of connection. In the quantum realm, meta-observation does not erase the individual. It harmonizes them with the whole. You are still the same person, living the same life. But now the self is no longer at the center. The observing consciousness stands silently behind the experience. And this silence is not disturbed by any noise from the outside world, because true balance lies not in controlling what is happening, but in being able to see it as it is. The most important thing to note at the end of this video is this. It's not about catching something on time or missing it. From a quantum perspective, no consciousness truly misses an experience it's not ready for. It only postpones information it's not ready to remember. The human mind is accustomed to thinking in terms of calendars, dates, and deadlines. However, consciousness is not tied to time in this way. What is essential for consciousness is the threshold of awareness. As long as this threshold is not crossed, even the strongest signals are perceived only as noise. That's why dates like December 20th are not a pressure element. They are a mirror. They don't impose anything on you. They only reflect whether you are ready or not. Remembering doesn't mean acquiring new information. Remembering is bringing to the surface something you already knew but had forgotten beneath your everyday perception. That's why this process is often calming, not exciting. It doesn't come like a moment of great enlightenment. It comes with the feeling of, I already knew it. In quantum consciousness, this feeling is one of the most reliable signals, because information that surprises the mind is temporary, but familiar awareness is permanent. If the feeling you experience during this phase is not one of haste but of gentle clarity, it indicates that remembering has begun. People often expect transformation to be dramatic. They want life to change overnight, old problems to disappear instantly. True transformation, from the outside, is almost boring. Life continues as before. The same people are there. The same responsibilities persist. What changes is the relationship with these things. Not every experience draws you in anymore. Not every thought sweeps you along. This is not a shrinking of life. It is an expansion of consciousness. What you thought you missed were actually possibilities that unnecessarily distracted you. When you remember, only what is yours remains. At this point, a significant misconception arises. People think that after remembering, they must remain in this state permanently. However, consciousness is fluctuating. Sometimes clarity increases, sometimes blurriness returns. These returns are not failures. In the quantum realm, consciousness does not remain at a fixed peak. It deepens and expands. Remembering is not a destination, but a direction. Once the direction changes, it is impossible to completely return to the old direction. Even if the mind tries its old habits, the following consciousness is already there. And this is an irreversible difference. The idea of missing out is fueled by fear. Remembering, on the other hand, is about trust. Trust isn't about believing everything will be all right. It's about sensing that what's happening is unfolding in a meaningful order. This intuition is the foundation of quantum consciousness, because consciousness expands not by clashing with the universe, but by harmonizing with it. These moments of harmony don't have to be rare or special. Sometimes it manifests in the silence a single sentence creates within you. Sometimes it's the spontaneous disappearance of the desire to do something. And sometimes it's when you realize you no longer want to ask the same questions. Missing out is merely the story of the mind. Remembering is the nature of consciousness. And when you realize this, the narrative has already achieved its purpose. If you've watched or read this far, it's not simply out of curiosity. It's because consciousness has become more open to such narratives. Not all content appeals to everyone. Some narratives only reach those on a certain frequency. This channel exists precisely for this reason. The aim here isn't to persuade or manipulate you. It's to preserve the space that reminds you of the awareness already within you. If this approach evokes a sense of calm and familiarity in you, then maintaining contact with this space is a conscious choice. Therefore, subscribing to this channel isn't just a casual following. It's a silent expression of your intention to remain on this frequency. At the quantum level, intention works more with what is directed than what is said. And specifically for this video, you can take a small but meaningful step to make this remembrance conscious. Simply write this sentence in the comments. I noticed a quantum signal. This isn't a wish or a hope. It's a symbolic sign clarifying the observer's position. In quantum consciousness, symbols work more powerfully than words because they target intention, not the mind. Writing this sentence is like leaving a trace for yourself, not for others. And wherever a trace is left, consciousness begins to expand, never to return. If these lines resonate with you, the message has been received, because remembering isn't proclaimed loudly, it's silently accepted.